Actually an update. Thank you, Pam. This is actually an updated version of our 101. This is recorded, and we will be sending that recording out in the follow-up email as well, along with other resources that you may need. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I did put in the pre-survey link in the chat box, but if you didn't get a chance to see that, you can always scan this QR code and take the pre-survey there. I'm definitely going to be encouraging you to take the pre-survey so we can make sure our work is up to date and relevant for our attendees. So the survey responses are very important to us. So I'm going to leave that up for a moment and about a minute. So if you want to go ahead and take that pre-survey, that would be great. And then we'll get started. Also, while you're taking the survey, you can always introduce yourself in the chat box and tell us where you're from. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that if you have questions, please put the questions in the Q&A. Don't put them in the chat. They're very hard to find that way. Pam will be going through the Q&A to ask the questions. So Pam Strickland, the founder of NC Stop Human Trafficking, is one of the presenters today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do want to remind you again, however, to take the pre-survey and put all your questions in the Q&A. I just don't want to lose them in the chat. So welcome to Human Trafficking 101. Today, we'll be talking about the very basics of what human trafficking is, and specifically how it looks like in North Carolina. But before we get started, I do want to tell you that a little bit about NC Stop Human Trafficking. We have a vision of a state free of human trafficking with a mission to create communities actively working to abolish human trafficking. And we do that in 4 action items. The first one would be education. It's what I'm doing here today with community members. But we also train service providers and other professionals who would come across survivors of human trafficking on how to best communicate, what red flags there are, and how to respond and make referrals. We also collaborate. Collaboration is necessary. Human trafficking is a complex issue that requires complex solutions, and the only way that can be achieved is through collaborative efforts. So we work on building coalitions in communities. We've founded and facilitate the Pitt County Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and under that coalition, there is the Pitt County Human Trafficking Multidisciplinary Team. We also are one of the 3 founding organizations for the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force, and we're going to unpack demand a little bit later. Legislation. So change begins with sound policy decisions. So we advocate for stronger anti-human trafficking legislation on state and federal levels. You'll learn more about what pieces of legislation we support a little later in this presentation when we talk about how you as a community member can be an advocate as well. And then fair trading. So we introduce fair trade products into the local markets. The more people who demand products free of forced labor, the less human trafficking there will be globally. Our Fair Traders Project is not only an effort to introduce fair trade products into the local market, but it also is a social enterprise for us as we are a nonprofit. So let's get started. What questions are we going to ask? Are we going to answer today? Well, we're going to be talking about what human trafficking is, what it really is, what it looks like in North Carolina, and what you can do about it. And I think you've made the first step into what you can do about it by being here today. So human trafficking is a big business. And when I talk about big business, I mean $150 billion business. This is an estimate from the United States Department of Trafficking and Persons report from 2022. But to be very transparent, that 150 billion number did come from the International Labor Organization report that was released in 2013. So there is really no new estimate out. Let me be very clear. This is just an estimate. We can't possibly know how much traffickers make because it is a crime that does operate undercover, but also in plain sight. And so by the time we finish this, you'll understand what I mean by that. After drug dealing, human trafficking is tied to the illegal arms trade as the second largest criminal industry in the world. It is also the fastest growing criminal industry in the world. Victimization, what does that look like? 49.6 million people around the world are victims of forced labor, forced commercial sexual exploitation, and forced marriage, according to the 2022 International Labor Office report. And again, I can't stress that this is an estimate. When we give numbers, we want to make it very clear that it's an estimate and this is the best guess that we have. The data around human trafficking is lacking, and as we go through this session today, you'll understand what I mean a little bit more about how that data is lacking. So this is what I'm talking about when I said NC Stop Human Trafficking was one of the 3 founding organizations for the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. If we look at demand for human trafficking victims, which would be demand for commercial sex and demand for cheap labor, then if we reduce that demand, then we can effectively reduce traffickers providing the supply. It's really a business model. And we haven't really focused on the demand side as much as we should to prevent human trafficking from occurring at all. To really unpack that, if you look at this triangle, the supply would be the bodies or the labor for sale, which would be victims. The demand are the purchasers, the sex buyers, and the people who want cheap labor. And the supplier, again, is the retailer, whether we're talking about labor trafficking or the trafficker. So that's kind of that is what we mean when we talk about human trafficking as a business and focusing more on demand to reduce trafficking as a whole. We won't go into that in too much detail, but I do encourage you to visit the NC Demand Reduction Task Force website, which will be in the follow-up email. So, what is human trafficking? This is the legal definition of human trafficking according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that is passed every 4 years. And I'm not going to read this legal definition. You'll get the slide deck in your follow-up, so you'll have it. You'll have the legal definition on hand. But what I do want to talk about in layman's term, what this definition means. It means compelling someone to work or perform a commercial sex act using force, fraud, and or coercion to gain something of value. And that something of value can be money, it can be influence, it can be material goods, it can be drugs, it could be even a ride home or just a place to stay. So when you think of it as what that thing of value is, it's not just money. Sex trafficking, again, this is according to the TVPA, or the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And what this means is compelling somebody to perform a commercial sex act using force, fraud, or coercion. And this is if the person is under the age of 18, however, in performing a commercial sex act, they are automatically victims of sex trafficking. And I will unpack that later. But right now, if they're over the age of 18, just understand force, fraud, or coercion is necessary. If they are under the age of 18, it is not. And that's the legal definition of sex trafficking. Now, what we oftentimes forget about when we talk about human trafficking, or we forget to bring up, is labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is notoriously underrepresented and under-talked about, but this session is going to address labor trafficking in North Carolina as well, and that is compelling somebody to work using force, fraud, or coercion. Now, just so you understand what the 3 elements of human trafficking are, it's right here. You have to have an action. So the trafficker must recruit, transport, harbor, provide, obtain, patronize, solicit, or advertise using force, fraud, and coercion, which we're going to unpack a little later, for the purpose of commercial sexual exploitation and forced labor. We put the AMP model in here, which is what it's actually called, action, means, and purpose, just to really solidify the 3 components of what human trafficking is. So with that, let's talk about force. What does force look like in a human trafficking experience? Before we get into that, I want to make sure everyone understands that human trafficking experiences are all different. And what we are talking about are common threads. So when we say force looks like physical abuse, sexual abuse, confinement, or forced drug use or being drugged, these are the common threads of what force can be in a human trafficking experience. you will notice that there is no forcible kidnap by a stranger on this slide, because that oftentimes is not the case. Forcible kidnap by a stranger is highly unlikely to become a human trafficking situation. And I want to make sure that's very clear, because it's also a common myth that makes that insurance people aren't really looking for what they need to look for to stay safe, number one. And even when we're talking about professionals in healthcare, law enforcement, school personnel, they're also seeing human trafficking through the lens of forcible kidnap by a stranger, and it's just not how that works out. But I can tell you what force really does look like in a human trafficking experience, and it comes from this case. Chester Fletcher Wallace is sentenced to 6 life terms for sex trafficking by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that's pretty recently, in November of 2023. So it showed that Wallace ran a sex trafficking ring out of a house in Durham. And what he did was he recruited homeless women or women with untreated substance use disorders and offered them housing and drugs. This component is going to be really focused on later when we talk about vulnerabilities. But once we get down to the house rules, they were abused and coerced, and if they did not follow the house rules, 2 survivors fled the house but were caught by Wallace or one of his associates and brought back to the house. So this is an example of what force looks like in a trafficking situation. It's the abuse, and it's also being caught and abused after house rules were broken. So what does fraud look like? Fraud is really how many trafficking experiences begin. It's the grooming and recruitment part of the trafficking experience, and that's selling the dream. Selling the romantic dream typically happens in sex trafficking cases. But it can happen in labor trafficking as well, but it is mostly seen in sex trafficking. And this is a seduction tactic in which the perpetrator grooms a person to believe they're a lover or a protector. And they do that through buying gifts, fancy dinners, and they present themselves as kind and sweet. And that makes that person fall in love with them. And that feeling of attachment and affection and love not only is the beginning of a human trafficking experience, but it's also what the survivor remembers and tries to get back to as that abuse cycle goes around and as that exploitive cycle goes around. And then we have selling the dream of prosperity, another piece of fraud. This oftentimes happened in labor trafficking cases, enticing a victim to work using a form of persuasion that would make the victim believe they will become financially better off. Not only does that happen in labor, but it also happens in sex trafficking too. Labor trafficking we'll unpack in a little bit. And the next case you will see is fraud, but it was sex trafficking. Not fraud, but yes, fraud, but it's selling the dream of prosperity. So this happened in New Hanover County. 6 were charged in the Cape Fear escorts and entertainment trafficking scheme. So it was a legitimate business running in the Wilmington area. And what happened was it was promised to 150 women and counting, because more victims and survivors are being identified, that they would make thousands of dollars dancing. What happened was the women were compelled to actually perform commercial sex acts, and the alleged perpetrators took the proceeds. Christopher Todd Evans, who's at the top left here, was charged with 229 felonies related to human trafficking and narcotics violations, which is an astronomical amount of charges. And I also do want to highlight the narcotics violations as well. We'll see common threads of substance use disorder that makes people vulnerable, and is also a mechanism of coercion too, which brings me to coercion. Coercion in human trafficking experiences often look like seizure of documentation. Many assume that this only happens to foreign-born nationals, but it also happens to people born here as well. Of course, passports and visas are taken, but people born here, their IDs are taken, their birth certificates are taken, and their social security cards are seized by the trafficker. So imagine all the things you can't do if you don't have an ID, you don't have your birth certificate, and you don't have a social security card. You can't get a job, you can't get housing, you can't get any government assistance. You're really dependent on the trafficker at that point. So that is a powerful coercive mechanism. When we have psychological threats or threats of harm to the victim or the victim's loved ones, debt bondage, which is often used in labor trafficking, but it can be in sex trafficking cases too, manipulation, and drugs. And we are going to go look at both manipulation and drugs in the case studies. The first is highlights the manipulation a trafficker can have over victims. Jonathan Lynn Jenkins, also called Max, recruited vulnerable women and minors who were struggling to survive. Again, I do want to highlight that struggling to survive piece again. We will talk about vulnerabilities, but in most of these cases that I'm going to show you today is the traffickers are highlighting a need that needs to be filled. So what he did was he promised a better life. That's a piece of fraud right there. And then how he ended up withholding their food and physically abusing them, that's a look at force. And he completely manipulated them into believing he had magical powers that allowed him to hunt those who escape down. He also reminded them that he had murdered someone else and served time in prison for it. And he attempted to murder a man who had helped one person escape this experience. This manipulation piece is very powerful. It's about when we're talking about human trafficking, but in this case specifically, he had already gone to prison for murder, and he reminded these victims constantly that he's done this before, he's killed someone before, and he would kill them too. And they ended up really, really believing that he had the magical powers that allowed him to hunt them down. So escape was impossible for them because of this manipulative piece. And this happened in Cumberland County, and this is an example of drugs used as a coercive mechanism. Robin Applewhite was sentenced to 230 years in prison in order to pay $608,000 in restitution to his victims after coercing them to sell commercial sex acts to support their heroin and prescription pill addictions. What he did was he ended up found women online who were already involved in the commercial sex trade, set up dates, or women he knew had a substance use disorder, set up dates with them, and offered to provide them with drugs if they did, some work for him. And so they came over, and they originally thought that was not a bad plan. But what ended up happening was he was incredibly abusive, and he ended up locking them into his basement. And that's how that substance use disorder that's untreated can be a vulnerability, but also very coercive, because you get very sick when you don't get those drugs. So withholding drugs and providing drugs are oftentimes coercive mechanisms for traffickers. So what does it look like in North Carolina then? When we give numbers, I know you've already heard this, but I always like to give a little notation. These are just numbers to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So first, I'm going to ask you, how many of you have actually used a hotline? Think about that for a minute. And understand that this is just to the National Human Trafficking Hotline to begin with. So this doesn't include law enforcement investigations. It doesn't include domestic violence shelters housing survivors. This doesn't include children advocacy centers responding to victims of child sexual exploitation, which is child sex trafficking. This doesn't include local, state, and federal law enforcement investigations. This doesn't include healthcare providers treating victims in a healthcare setting. It doesn't include all those who have gone unidentified, and in a lot of times, it doesn't include human trafficking agencies serving survivors. So this number is just a number for the National Human Trafficking Hotline in a nutshell. It's 223 human trafficking cases confirmed, according to the hotline, with 340 victims involved. I would argue that this number is much higher in reality, but we don't have the data. This happened as actually several locations, 8 different massage parlors, but 2 women were sentenced to one 18 months and the other 50 months for attempting to bribe a law enforcement officer to provide protection to illicit massage businesses. This was actually a coordinated takedown across 4 different federal districts that included the execution of search warrants at 8 different massage parlors, multiple residents, and the arrest of 6 individuals, including the 2 women. In This is a case of human trafficking, but as you can see, it's not, the headline doesn't say human trafficking. So what we're going to look at here is a business front that North Carolina has a problem with illicit massage businesses to begin with. And these two women were bribing law enforcement officers for protection. So I would say that human trafficking is definitely operating in plain sight. And if they believed that they could bribe law enforcement, which would indicate to me personally that they've done it before. So that's just a statewide massage parlor operation that I wanted to bring to your attention. Other case demographics from the hotline. And again, these are just from the hotline. So it says ages for 149 adults, 51 minors, genders, females 180, males 25. I do want to highlight that men and boys are trafficked. And citizenship, foreign nationals 34 and U.S. citizens 15. I will make it very clear that if you look at these demographics, it doesn't add up to what I just said earlier about the cases confirmed or the victims involved. And that's because this is just only what the hotline could collect on demographics. So if you're looking for the demographics of human trafficking, you're not going to find very, very good data around that either. So let's get into labor trafficking. Labor trafficking in North Carolina, what we're looking at predominantly is going to be agricultural work and domestic work, but this state's also had an issue with janitorial jobs, factories, construction sites, restaurants, hotels, nail salons. North Carolina's reported cases in begging rings and traveling sales crews as well, and fishery and other agricultural issues with livestock. So labor trafficking is a huge issue in North Carolina when we look at the agricultural industry. And with that, I'm going to go into this case. If you're wondering about labor trafficking across the country, up to 19 industries do report labor trafficking issues. So this happened in Greene County. They were charged an unlawful recruitment fee, which was a #1 red flag, right? They came here lawfully under the H-2A guest worker visa program, which you're not supposed to charge you're not supposed to charge a recruitment fee. So they came here under a debt bondage situation already. They didn't get what they were promised. They were subjected to threats and coercive manipulation to keep working, and they had their passports confiscated. Again, there is no reason why an adult doesn't have their identification documents and someone else does. And as you can see, this is actually a settlement and not a federal crime story, because sometimes labor trafficking cases are really hard to prosecute. And it's just like the illicit massage business case earlier. Justice is however, justice can be gotten for some survivors. So the farm worker unit did secure a $75,000 settlement in this labor trafficking case. This happened in Mecklenburg County, and the trafficker is a family member. We're going to unpack familial trafficking too a little bit later. But in this case, the perpetrator inflicted mental and physical abuse, had the victim under a debt bondage situation. It made that survivor work 10 hours a day for 6 to 7 days a week, falsely alleged poor work performance by the survivor, and treated the survivor in a humiliating and demeaning fashion. So that alleging poor work performance and treating that person in a humiliating and demeaning fashion is also mental abuse and emotional abuse, especially since it's coming from a family member. And at the end of the day, that survivor feared her and was believed that she could not leave, or they could not leave. The difference between labor exploitation and labor trafficking is the idea that the victim cannot leave. Both are illegal. Let me be very clear. Both are wrong. But it's labor trafficking when those people fear leaving. So let's get into sex trafficking. This is a video that's going to upload any minute now. There we go. Hold on one second. I'm going to share the sound and optimize for the video clip. And just so you know, this is a pretty, this video is from is created by a woman who is a survivor, and she opened a drop-in center in New York. It's a little dated, so the numbers aren't correct, are probably not correct now. But what she's talking about are the common threads and how young people are recruited in a sex trafficking experience. Okay. Okay. Give me 1 second and let me pull up this video, okay?
While she's doing that, if y'all have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A.
I'm so sorry. I've got to run through these to get to there we go. Okay. Thank you for your patience on that. I do appreciate it. And now I'm going to go ahead and share this video.
You know, you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are, and you know how pretty your hair looks, and it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at, and he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And so that night he takes you to a club, and he puts you up on the stage, and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead, baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room, and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do, and yet there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 cents, and he takes you to McDonald's, and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made. And right now, you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
and you feel like this is the best that it's ever gonna get, and everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment, or the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it will be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you'll do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac and you're eating McDonald's and you're listening to 50 and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
Thank you so much for your patience on that. I've got to flip over to the new the PowerPoint that we're actually in the process of. So just give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. Oh, I really do appreciate you you all bearing with me on this. If there's any questions, please go ahead and ask it while I'm working this out.
One person was asking about places that they might be able to volunteer or help in some way with human trafficking in the Charlotte or Hickory area. So there are a number of organizations in Charlotte, and so I will email those to you. I am not personally familiar with any in Hickory, but I will send some information to the email address that you gave me in the Q&A.
So thank you so much, everybody, for your patience on that. This is a new presentation that we are doing. So we did have a little hiccup on that video. So let's talk about sex trafficking. If they're over the age of 18, in order for it to be prosecutable, I want to be very clear, it must be proven that the person is being used for a commercial sex act by force, fraud, or coercion for it to be prosecutable in the court of law. However, if they are under the age of 18 and being used for a commercial sex act, that is a child. That child is considered a victim of trafficking, and no further criteria must be met. So what I mean by that is there doesn't necessarily have to be a third-party controller or a trafficker for them to be considered victims of child sex trafficking or minor sex trafficking or domestic minor sex trafficking, or victims of commercial sexual exploitation. There's a lot of terms that can go under this umbrella, right? So who would be held accountable for that action if there is no third-party controller, but that is a child involved in a commercial sex act? Well, the buyer, because they are paying to sexually abuse a child. I don't want to sanitize that language in any way, and we'll go further and when we talk about a little bit more about child sex trafficking as this presentation goes on. The average age of someone first being sex trafficked is between 11 and 14 years old. So there is no such thing as a child prostitute. These are abused children and victims of sex trafficking. I turned off my camera. I hope the sound is a little bit better. So let me know if the sound doesn't improve, and I'll see what else I can do. So, and as we talk about child sex trafficking, these are all the cases of child sexual exploitation. These are just headlines of child sexual exploitation in the state of North Carolina, right? Wilton man sentenced to 12 years in prison for child pornography offenses. We're going to talk about child sexual abuse material in a little bit. North Carolina man gets 330-year sentence for human trafficking of children. That was in May of 2023. Chatham woman charged with human trafficking, abuse, created child porn. That was also in 2023. So I can't read all these headlines to you, but I just wanted to illustrate how prevalent it is in North Carolina. And you'll see a lot of child pornography offenses on these headlines. This is the last time we'll be using the term child pornography. As we move along, we'll be talking about child sexual abuse material, but I'll unpack that term in just a moment. So with that, who are the traffickers? Well, first we have familial traffickers, or caregivers or family that are traffickers. 1 in 6 victims under the age of 12 are trafficked by caregivers. It's kind of hard for us to wrap our mind around that caregivers were trafficked, the people that are caring for, whether they be children or people with a developmental delay or people with an intellectual disability, but that is a common trafficker dynamic. And then we want to look at romantic partners and managers. Sexual exploitation of people is glorified in our society, and this is what I mean by that. Dennis Hoff, who owned the Bunny Ranch in Nevada, the legal it's a legal brothel in Nevada. He's dead now, but he owned the Bunny Ranch. This legal brothel spawned clothing, a TV series, and really glamorized the exploitation of women. And then we can look at Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy. He is considered a cultural icon, but the power dynamics at the Playboy Mansion reveals experience tantamount to human trafficking as well. And I say that because as the women leave the Playboy Mansion and they come out and tell people what happened, if you really listen to what they're saying or what they're describing is sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. But we don't recognize that because this type of lifestyle is really glamorized and accepted. So who are traffickers then? Well, they're anybody willing to exploit the vulnerabilities of somebody else, whether that be for money or for influence. There is no set gender that a trafficker is. There's no race, no ethnicity. It's quite literally anybody willing to exploit the vulnerabilities of someone else. And these are all photographs of traffickers or alleged traffickers in North Carolina. So, what are the contributors to trafficking then? Well, untreated substance use disorders. First of all, drugs are used as a form of manipulation and coercion, which is reflective of the case we saw earlier in this presentation with Robin Applewhite in Cumberland County. Drugs are used as a way for a victim to cope with their trauma. A human trafficking experience is incredibly traumatic. And many survivors or victim survivors develop a substance use disorder to cope with all that. The opioid crisis has led to an overburdened foster care system in the state, which leads to more vulnerable children, the more children that fall through the cracks. And I'm going to say this, forced selling of drugs is labor trafficking. Traffickers oftentimes compel victims to do a lot of illegal activities, and one of those illegal activities is selling drugs. But we can also look at gang involvement when we're talking about the forced selling of drugs as well. In North Carolina, there's a prevalence of gang activity, largely due to locations on I-95 and I-85 corridor and in larger cities. So what gangs do is they make money off by trafficking girls and women for sex, but they also use a form of labor trafficking to facilitate illegal activity. So for a minute, I want you to think about how gangs recruit young people. They recruit young people just like traffickers do. They find a need in a young person that needs to be met, and the gangs offer that need. Oftentimes, that is a need for safety and security, a need for a family or somebody to support them. So if you look at the dynamics of gang involvement and you look at the dynamics of trafficking, when we're talking about recruitment, they're very similar. And once you enter into a gang, it's very difficult to leave. So I really do want to highlight gang involvement as a contributor to trafficking, because in many cases it is, especially when we're talking about sex trafficking with the girls and the women for sex to make money for the gang, but also that form of labor trafficking. To be very clear, though, I don't think that it's really hard for the judicial system to kind of see labor trafficking through gangs because they're doing illegal activity. So they oftentimes do get victims oftentimes do get arrested for crimes that they are kind of compelled to commit. Pornography is another contributor. Pornography production and sex trafficking are not always separate. So pornography is the #1 venue for sex trafficking in the US, according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and #3 venue in North Carolina. So this, and just so we're on the same page, this is according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, but it's kind of stunning because the common idea around pornography is that it's a regulated industry, that these folks are doing this because they want to, but the numbers show that that is not the case. And now we've got to talk about child sexual abuse material. So RAIN, or the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. So there's 85 million images of 85 million child sexual abuse images online. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reports 32 million. Said they had 32 million reports of CSAM. We are calling this child sexual abuse material and not child pornography because pornography too has gotten a positive connotation in our society. And the last thing this organization is going to do is attach anything positive or anything seen as positive to child sexual abuse. These are images and videos of children being sexually abused. And I want to be very clear about that. I also want you to know that the internet is saturated with CSAM. And the reason it's saturated with CSAM, again, I'm going to go back to the demand for it, because there is demand for it. If nobody wanted to see these images, then it wouldn't be available. But that's not the case, sadly. This is another case of what demand for CSAM looks like. A Havelock City Commissioner, Pete Van Vleet, was arrested on 12 counts of second-degree sexual exploitation of a minor by the SBI. So according to those arrest warrants, the SBI found video files of children engaging in various sex acts with other children as well as adults. So Pete Van Vleet pleaded guilty, and he was only really sentenced to 5 years of probation, and he is listed on the sex offender registry. So when we're talking about demand reduction, to be sure, we should really look at this case to highlight why there is such demand and why people who do demand these kind of things feel like it's okay. The punitive ramifications of this is so minimal, in this case anyway, and in most cases, honestly. So that's an example of the demand for child sexual abuse material and how there is very little punitive recourse. When we talk about who pays the price, human trafficking is often a low-cost crime for the trafficker and the demand side, the buyer. And the person who pays the most is always the survivor or the victim. And this is an example of that as well. So with that, let's talk about some risk factors and indicators, and then we'll get into what you can do. So some risk factors. When I talk about vulnerable populations, I'm not saying these people are inherently vulnerable to believing the the tales of traffickers. They're not less smart or more naive. They have a need that needs to be met, and traffickers come in, see that need, and offer to meet that need. So let's get into vulnerable populations then. People with an untreated substance use disorder, people with an untreated mental illness, people who have a learning disability, people who have a developmental delay, survivors of child sexual abuse, people who have involvement in the judicial or CPS system, people who lack social supports, those people in marginalized communities, people who live in poverty and have debts, people who are experiencing insecure housing situations. Earlier, when I was talking about the cases and how these traffickers recruited women who didn't have homes or had untreated substance use disorders, this is what I mean. They were more vulnerable to being trafficked because they had needs that had to be met. So traffickers are really good at identifying that, and they're really good at exploiting people's needs. So now that we talked about vulnerabilities, let's talk about a few red flags. So in buildings, homes, and businesses, so what you'll see at a facility, that is a possible indicators of human trafficking. So that facility, that building, that home has unusual security measures, cameras outside a building that really doesn't look like people want to break into it or have anything of value in there, barbed wire facing in, well, that's a prison. Locks installed backwards on doors. So they're locking people inside instead of locking people outside. Does that make sense? A lot of women come and go, but rarely leave. And if they do, they're escorted. Lots of coming and going, mostly males. And we highlight males because I want to be very clear. All the data points to the demand side of sex trafficking are predominantly male to the tune of 98 to 99%. Which means there are 1 to 2% are women. So mostly males is what we're going to say for that. Employees live where they work, and employees arrive and leave in the same vehicle. This is oftentimes labor trafficking, but this also happens in illicit massage businesses. I'm not saying carpooling is bad, but just, put all the red flags together. Red flags of human trafficking in a person. So someone else has their identification documents. So if they don't have their identification documents, but someone else does, that's really a huge indicator. Why does another person not have your identification documents? Have their identification documents. They lack control of their schedule. So they are, that indicates somebody's controlling them. If it's a child, they frequently run away. You want to ask yourself, well, where are they running? Who are they running to, or what are they running from? Very solid questions for that. If a person in distress, someone acting fearful, anxious, depressed, tense, or paranoid, I'm not saying that's 100% human trafficking, but I am going to say if somebody is acting fearful, anxious, depressed, tense, and paranoid, it's okay to ask that person if they're okay. So it doesn't have to be a trafficking situation, but if someone's acting that way, please ask them if they're all right. Branding marks. So tattoos of initials, a name, initials with a crown, etc. That's typically a trafficking experience for sure. A person is isolated from their family, friends, or support system. That person is affiliated with a gang. Again, you can see these indicators and red flags often intersect with people's vulnerabilities and other social intersections of human trafficking. Physical signs of trauma with a vague story about how those injuries were obtained. I don't know how often you're going to come across that, but that is an indicator. There's a much older romantic partner. The person references frequent travel. There is nothing wrong with frequent travel, but the references I'm referring to are more like odd. Like I'm going up to New Jersey one day, and then I'm going down to Georgia for one day, and then I'm going to Florida for 2 days, and then I'm coming to South Carolina for one day, and then I'll be back. What the question is, what's going on there? That is a strange travel patterns. Person lives with their boss. So those are a few indicators. Now we want to talk about what you can do. And before we do that, I want to talk about what you don't need to do. This is really important, okay? Do not be a hero, because you are going to endanger yourself, and you will endanger the victim involved in that experience as well. Please don't ask if they're being trafficked. Many people don't know what trafficking is. That's why you're here today. You're learning more. A lot of people don't know what it is still. Don't try to take them with you. That's dangerous, and when somebody wants to leave a situation, if they're adults, they really should, ask for assistance. You don't need to try to take anybody with you, and please don't confront the boss. These are the things you do not want to do. I'm going to reiterate this. Don't be a hero. Don't ask if they're being trafficked. Don't try to take them with you, and don't confront the boss or the trafficker. What you can do is be observant and take pictures if you can do so safely. If you cannot, don't. Take down the license plate or address if you can. Call 911 if someone is in immediate danger. So with that, this is how you can report. If it is somebody under the age of 18 and involved in a commercial sex trade, you need to call DSS and law enforcement. It is a mandatory reporting law in North Carolina that you do both of those things. So if they're under the age of 18 and involved in the commercial sex trade, you need to call this. Or if you believe that they're involved in a labor trafficking case as well, call DSS and law enforcement, because that's child maltreatment and that falls under the mandatory reporting law. You can also call your local law enforcement. I would honestly tell you that you would probably need to ask for officer trained in crisis intervention, or when you do talk to that law enforcement officer, say this is a human trafficking report. It's really important that you clarify when you call local law enforcement, because sometimes law enforcement aren't trained in what human trafficking is. So it's important that you're very clear when you make your report if you decide to call law enforcement. I'm always going to recommend that you call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. When you call that hotline, the professionals respond to it like it's a human trafficking case, like it's a human trafficking victim. And that's the safest way to make your report if the person's over the age of 18. But again, if they're under the age of 18, call DSS and law enforcement. I do encourage you, if you have any questions about reporting, to put it in the Q&A so we can clear that up, because this is a big thing that I want you to know. So what else you can do? You can join the movement. NC Stop Human Trafficking is a membership organization. So you can join as a member, join as an agency, or join as a business. And please, by all means, stay up to date. Follow our YouTube channel, Facebook, Instagram, and our Twitter account, or it's X now, but you can do all that. We share frequently. You can also become an advocate, which is so important. We need your help. We need you to support policies that improve housing options in your community, improve access to food, shelter, and safety, improve response to sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse, improve access to healthcare, improve access to mental health services, improve access to substance use disorder treatment, policies that reduce prevalence and exposure to CSAM online, and policies that improve education for youth about healthy relationships, consent, and internet safety. As you can see, all these policies are designed to make sure people have their needs met. So traffickers don't come in to do it for us, right? So become an advocate if you can. And you can buy fair trade products. You can go to fairtradersproject.org if you want to support our organization, or you can go to the grocery store and look for these logos and be a conscientious consumer. And you can also become an ally. This is a wonderful organization. This is the Survivor Network of North Carolina, and it supports survivors as they work toward restoration. So they have peer mentoring and coaching, professional development, mental health support, career case management, and a survivor community. If you want to learn more about the Survivor Network, go to www.survivornetworknc.org. And just so you know, they have an event coming up this Saturday, Allies Rising, virtual brunch and learn. It's Saturday at February 3rd from 11 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. and it's virtual, so it's very accessible. The Survivor Network actually helped us craft this training. They're a very valuable organization, and if you get a chance, learn more about them. This is our contact information. As you can see, Pam, who will be giving me the questions in a minute if we have any, me, of course, and then we have Vanessa, our training and outreach coordinator, who I'm sure is in this room as an attendee. And so with that, I'm going to ask you to fill out that post survey for us. I would really appreciate it. And thank you so much. And I'll be taking those questions now.
So we have someone who wants to know if there's another 101 scheduled. She wants to be sure that her teammates are able to participate.
Um, there is not another 101 scheduled, but we will schedule another one. I can't really say when, but if they have signed up for our newsletter, they'll know.
But in the meantime, we're going to send out a recording of this one that everyone here will receive, so that can be shared.
Yes.
And this will be on our YouTube channel. So although we don't currently have another 101 scheduled, there are certainly ways to access this information.
Right. There definitely are.
Another question is, it's kind of a two-part question. So when children are fooled into taking pictures of their genitalia and then send them somewhere and then are blackmailed, is that called sexting?
Yes.
And is that pornography?
Okay, that is a very good question. Whoever asked that, good one. That is called, there's a lot of things that's called. It's sexting. It's called self-generated child sexual abuse material. It is also called child porn, depending on what lens you're looking through. And it's extortion because if they're blackmailing that child, that's also definitely a crime. So I think I may have answered all of those questions. That is all of what that is. Now, the issue with self-generated child sexual abuse material, I want to be very clear for everybody to understand this. It is actually common for young people to do this now with the app. This is how relationship norms are now. So it is super important that caregivers really sit down and talk with their young people about the potential of what could happen if if they do send out these images. Um, that is going to be really, really very, very important because these young people, it's considered normal now. So that's not an uncommon thing to happen. And then it's not an uncommon thing for sextortion to come out of it. And that's why it's so important to have that open line of communication with your young people, because if sextortion does develop from them making that mistake and sending out that image, they need to have somebody to come to. So it's definitely going to be important that they come to the adult in their life. I hope I answered that question. I feel like I may have over answered that question, but I wanted to be clear.
I don't have any other questions right now. If somebody else wants to pop in,
I really must have nailed it.
you must have.
I do want to thank everybody for their patience with me on the technical difficulties. I will also put the post survey link in the chat too, just in case you missed the QR code. And some people are logging in on their tablets or mobile devices. And we really encourage you to fill out the post survey so we can make our trainings really what they need to be.
Well, I do not see any other questions coming through.
Okay, thank you all for your kind compliments. I appreciate that. I was really excited to give this updated 101. So I'm really happy to have you all here. Thank you so much. I will put I had a question about scanning the QR code. I will put that back in the chat so you can click the link if that works for you. Gotta make sure I'm getting everybody in here. I think I keep sending messages to Pam. Sorry, Pam. So the post survey link is in the chat box now if you had difficulty scanning. And thank you so much. I appreciate y'all doing that. The recording will be available on YouTube, and it will also be available in the follow-up email. Thank you for that question. Thank you. So we don't have any more questions. If anybody has any questions, please put it in the Q&A. I'll give you about another minute, and then I'll say have a great afternoon, and thank you for being here. Okay. All right. Thank you. We'll be sending out that follow-up email shortly, hopefully by the end of the day, but maybe tomorrow. I'm not sure yet. Do you have training for teenagers? We actually do talk to young people. We don't have requests to do that very often, however, but we do talk to young people about internet safety and healthy relationships. We'll have a human trafficking talk with them as well, but it's mostly around human trafficking prevention. So when we talk to young people, it's more like stay safe online. This is what a healthy relationship looks like. This is what exploitation is. So if you see it among your peers, or you feel like you're in an unhealthy relationship, find somebody to help. But we do have trainings for teenagers. Yes, it's just not. I mean, it does talk about human trafficking, but it's more around having safe relationships and staying safe online and making good choices and stuff. So that was a good question. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for being here, and have a wonderful afternoon. And we'll be sending out that follow-up shortly. Thanks. Bye.